I expect many of you have got onto a train on a Sunday evening, and then you suddenly realize that it's full of soldiers. They're all returning to their base. And many of them, of course, are beginning or in the midst of their basic training. The week ahead will be hard. They'll be expected to get up early in the morning, quite possibly 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning. They will have long days of marching, of going on long walks with a heavy rucksack. They'll be doing many activities. And at the end of the week, they will be exhausted, lacking in sleep. But hey, they're soldiers. We expect them to be able and willing to suffer. And of course, it's not just us who are familiar with soldiers. In the time of Paul, he also was familiar with soldiers. But of course, Roman soldiers. And their life, and I think this is fair to say, was far more difficult than our Swiss army soldiers. They would be expected to go to faraway places and also to enter into battle where they could lose limbs or even lose their lives. It's very interesting as we look at Paul, because he speaks to Timothy in his second letter that he writes to Timothy in chapter 2. He writes to him, "Join me in suffering as a good soldier of Jesus Christ." He also says a bit more to Timothy about being a soldier, but we'll come to that in a moment. But what we find is that Paul speaks to Timothy as if he's a soldier. Of course, he wasn't really saying that Timothy was a soldier or he was a soldier, but he's presenting the fact that we are to be like soldiers as Christians. And when we stop and think about it, we realize that in many ways are we like soldiers. We're in the midst of a battle, fights. I mean, if you're a true believer, I'm sure you've struggled with your wrong desires, trying to resist them. I'm sure you've also been in this battle. You've seen the trends of the world, and you realize that they are very different to what is expected of a Christian. And there is a struggle there. And let's not also forget that there is a spiritual struggle. Paul writes at one point, "We fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers." So the Christian is in a fight. He has struggles and he is expected to suffer. Of course, there is also another type of suffering, and not so much in Switzerland, but when we go to other parts of the world, we find that Christians can be discriminated against. They can be put into prison and even killed. And if we look back in time, many Christians have suffered and died for being believers. Paul himself, probably along with a lot of other Christians at that time, almost certainly was executed in Rome after writing this letter to Timothy. Now, when we stop and think about it, not only do we realize that there is suffering as a Christian, but we also understand that we're expected to suffer. Just think of the words of Jesus Christ. "If anyone comes after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." And of course, he was speaking at a time when the criminals, when they were crucified, would often have to carry the top part of the cross to the place where they'd be crucified and killed. Jesus understood and expected his disciples to be willing to suffer and even to die. So let's just pause for a moment as we think about being a soldier of Jesus Christ, not just any soldier, but a good soldier. We can always find examples of bad soldiers, soldiers that complain and moan, soldiers that run away from the battle. But we are to be good soldiers. So let me ask you, are you someone, as a believer, who is willing and ready to suffer as you go about your Christian life? But let's come a bit more to Paul's words, because he also writes to Timothy and says that anyone who is a soldier, serving as a soldier, he does not get entangled in civilian affairs, but rather he seeks to please his serving commander. He seeks to please his commanding officer. And when we think about this a bit more, we realize, yes, what happens when you're in the army? The commanding officer is there and he gives orders. And what does the soldier do? Well, he jumps. He acts on those orders. If he's told to hold a position against enemy fire, he does it. And he doesn't give up until he's told otherwise. If he or she is told to march 30 kilometers with a heavy rucksack and all his equipment, he or she does it. That's what the good soldier does. And of course, they do it without moaning, complaining. In fact, they're delighted to serve their commanding officer. You know, as Christians, we also have a commanding officer, the Lord Jesus Christ. A great commanding officer, someone who's won victories in the past, upon the cross and in the resurrection, but also the full extent of these victories will be shown in the future. And this is the officer. Christ is our commanding officer who we serve. Well, how do we please our commanding officer? Well, just like the soldiers in the army, we do what he tells us. We listen to what he says and we act upon it. And as we think a bit more about this, then we come to this other part that Paul mentions, this other point, that a good soldier doesn't get entangled in civilian affairs, especially with a professional army. When those Roman soldiers were sent abroad, they weren't expected to get involved with business, trying to make as much money as possible. No, they were to keep to the task of soldiering. They were to be focused on that. And it's like that as a Christian. Yes, it may be that God gives us money or fame or popularity, but that's not what we seek. We seek, like a good soldier, to serve our commanding officer. We do not get distracted. So we've looked over and seen this picture of a Christian as a soldier. We've seen that he's willing to suffer. And he expects suffering. He doesn't complain about this. We see that he also seeks to serve and listen and act upon the words of the commanding officer. And also, he's not distracted with other things. So let me ask you now, as a believer, and I ask myself as well, are you a good soldier of Jesus Christ?